had always loved the outdoors and camping was one of my favorite activities. So when my friends suggested we take a trip to a remote campsite in the woods, I jumped at the chance. We arrived at the campsite in the late afternoon and set up our tents. Everything seemed normal at first, but as the sun began to set, strange things started happening. We heard rustling in the bushes and the sound of twigs snapping in the distance. We tried to brush it off as just some wildlife, but the noises continued throughout the night. As we settled in for the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I tried to ignore it and fall asleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I felt a presence in the darkness. In the middle of the night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside our tent. I assumed it was just one of my friends getting up to use the bathroom, but when I peeked outside, there was no one there. That's when things really started to get strange. My friends and I all heard whispers and giggles coming from outside our tents. At first we assumed it was just other campers nearby, but as the whispers grew louder, we realized it was something else entirely. The whispers turned into full-blown laughter, and it sounded like it was coming from all around us. It was so loud that we couldn't even hear each other speak. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the laughter stopped. We were all completely freaked out by this point, but we tried to convince ourselves that it was just our imaginations. We huddled together in our tents, trying to ignore the strange occurrences outside. But then, we heard something else. It was a deep, guttural growling sound, like nothing we have ever heard before. It was so loud that it sounded like it was coming from right outside our tent. I peeked outside and saw a pair of glowing eyes staring back at me from the darkness. I couldn't see anything else, but I knew that whatever it wasn't friendly. We packed up our things as quickly as we could and hiked out of the woods in the middle of the night. We never went back to that campsite again. To this day, I have no idea what we encountered out there in the woods, but I know that it was something truly terrifying and something that I'll never forget. After that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever we had encountered in the woods was still following us. I would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, convinced that the creature with the glowing eyes was outside my window. I tried to tell my friends and family what had happened, but no one believed me. They thought I was just being paranoid, or I had simply had a nightmare. But I knew that what I had experienced was real, and as the weeks went by, I started to do some research into the history of the campsite we had stayed at. It turns out that the campsite was built on an ancient burial ground, and that there had been reports of strange occurrences and unexplained noises in that area for decades. As I read more about the history of the site, I realized that we had stumbled upon something truly terrifying. Something that had been lurking in the woods for centuries and waiting for unsuspecting campers to stumble upon its domain. I became obsessed with learning everything I could about the creature that had haunted us that night. I spent countless hours poring over books and articles about the supernatural, trying to find any clue that would help me understand what we had encountered. And then one day I found something. It was an old journal entry written by a woman who had camped at the same site back in the 1800s. In the entry, she described a creature with glowing eyes and razor-sharp teeth that had terrorized her and her family during their stay. As I read the journal entry, I felt a sense of both relief and horror. Relief because I finally had proof that what we had encountered was real. And horror because I knew that this creature was still out there, lurking in the woods, waiting for its next victim. I don't know what the future holds, but I do know that I'll never forget that camping trip. And I'll never forget the feeling of pure terror that washed over me as we hiked out of those woods in the middle of the night. So if you ever find yourself camping in a remote area, be careful, because you never know what kind of horrors might be lurking in the darkness. If you ever hear a cry for help at night while camping, ignore it. I love to camp, but after my most recent trip, I don't think it will ever be the same. I set up my tent on a nice flat ground and collected some wood for a fire. The night came with all its nightly sounds, and I relaxed at the hooting owls and chirping crickets. Even better was the fact that no one else was around. Help. It was subtle, I almost missed it. The voice came from deep within the woods, and for a moment I didn't believe what I was hearing. It sounded female, but oddly enough, I just couldn't tell. Please help. It continued. I shined my flashlight between the bushes and walked around. To be completely honest, even as a grown man, I was paralyzed with fear. So I did the responsible thing and called the local police. That's when things went from odd to very, very weird. The police told me to ignore it. I explained to them that someone could be injured and probably needed medical attention, but they assured me otherwise. When I kept pushing and asked why, they told me, "Sir, if you ever hear that voice again, ignore it. Do not respond, and do not approach." Well, I did hear it again, but I did not ignore it. It was almost midnight when I heard the voice a second time. I awoke to someone whispering, "Help," and it sounded like she was just outside my tent. I went out to check and no one was there, but the voice continued from a distance, "Help, please." Again, I grabbed my flashlight and looked around the area I was camping. I was too afraid to follow the voice into the woods, especially since the authorities themselves avoided it. But I struggled morally, trying to decide whether I should go and help this person, or listen to the police who were concerned for my safety. But then I heard another voice, a different voice. This other voice, which also seemed to be coming from the woods, was an octave lower. Unlike the first one, which cried for help, this one was loud and demanding. "Quiet," the other voice demanded. "No one's going to help you." Once I heard that, I was sure someone was in trouble. I called the police again, and when I informed them about a second voice coming from the woods, they seemed even more concerned. They told me that I should pack my things and leave the campsite immediately. They said that hearing the second, more manly voice meant that it was getting desperate. They also said that two voices were coming from the same person. That part was bizarre and confused me, to say the least. It was at this point I dismissed the police in that area as crazy, but not before telling them off. I got angry. I told them that if they didn't get down here to come and check it out, then I would do it myself. I said repeatedly that a woman could be in serious trouble, but that it was their duty to help her, but they still refused to come. All they kept repeating to me over the phone was, "Do not enter the woods, sir." They seemed more afraid than I was. Once I hung up the phone, I heard the voices again. A gentle, "Please, somebody help me." And then a growling, "Quiet, no one's coming." It was a little past midnight at that point. I couldn't live with myself knowing that I had the chance to save someone's life, but instead cowered. So I grabbed some things and ventured into the woods. When I entered the woods, the voices ceased, just like that. No cries, no whispers, no commands. Even the owls and crickets went away. Nothing but the dancing leaves and creaking tree branches. I stopped walking and looked around, a full 360 degrees. "Hello? Anybody there?" I called out. Nothing. "I'm here to help," I continued. "Where are you? Are you okay?" Still nothing. I thought of calling the police again, then chuckled to myself. I found it strange but somewhat comforting that I didn't find anybody out there. Nonetheless, I was still creeped out, so I packed my things and finally left the campsite. I don't know why the police of all people were so afraid. Worst case, someone was in actual danger and we've all failed them. Best case, morons would think saying "help me" in the middle of nowhere is a great idea for a prank. To be honest, when I heard the voice the very first time, I did think it was a joke, But when I heard it the second time, along with that other voice, I became a bit more concerned. And same with the third time I heard it in the woods. But when I heard it again a fourth time, a week after I left the campsite, coming from inside my house, I became very, very concerned. I grew up in a relatively small town, just outside the suburbs of Chicago. The neighborhood was pretty nice, and I often look back on those times fondly. Sometimes I drive through the neighborhood for a little nostalgic trip when I'm feeling down, and it never ceases to bring me joy whenever I see a little kid running along the very same sidewalk I used to scooter down. One of the things me and my buddies loved doing during that tranquil time of our lives was walking to the nearby convenience stores to load up on snacks. It was a little ways from our house though, so our parents weren't too keen on us going, but we often did anyway just for the hell of it. Strangely, we never got caught. Some of the fondest memories with my buddies happened outside that very store. Recently, however, the store closed down due to a lack of customers. It made sense seeing as how the neighborhood itself was starting to lower in popularity. The store had also only ever been run by one man, Mr. Eisen. Mr. Eisen was a jolly old man. He treated all his customers with respect, and he sometimes got away with giving us free snacks and drinks when business was good. It broke my heart to learn that he also recently passed away, which made the closing of the store all the more depressing. Not long after the store's closure, one of the more daring members of my friend group, we'll call him John, he called me. John was a big horror guy. He loved watching documentaries and TV shows about stuff like ghost hunting or playing really old horror games. He wanted to do a late night camping trip at the store the following night. The building itself hadn't been rented out or gutted by this point. At first I was hesitant, seeing as how I'm not exactly the type to break into restricted areas. But alas, John convinced me, and he prepared a list of things I might need: food, water, sleeping bags, the usual. Luckily, one of my coworkers offered to cover my night shift, so I didn't miss any work. But looking back, I wish I had taken that shift. As I packed the following afternoon, I received a text from John asking to bring candles. He had seen a new type of ghost summoning ritual and he wanted to try it, but he didn't have candles. I agreed, but only because I didn't really believe in any of this ghost baloney. I didn't expect anything to come out of it, so I packed a couple of wax candles in some plastic bag and headed over. I arrived at the abandoned store at around 9 p.m. just after most of the cars got off the road. John was already inside, and he motioned me in. As I looked around, I got a weird shudder. I assumed that being in the store while it looked like this was kind of a liminal experience. The memories flooded back, but it made me uneasy rather than nostalgic. John eventually turned to me and asked for my candles. I reached into my bag and handed them to him, to which he promptly placed them in a triangular shape and lit them one by one. He then turned to me and handed me some kind of monitoring device and told me to tell him if it started beeping. So I did, and I watched. He began circling the triangle in salt from a bag, then said some kind of gibberish in another language. I wonder if he knows he looks like an idiot right now. Suddenly, the monitor started to beep. I looked over to John and told him it was beeping, but he didn't move a muscle. He just froze, not a single peep out of him. I figured he didn't hear me, so I went and shook his shoulder. "Hey," I said, "it's beeping, dude." No movement. I went around to look at his face. He was stuck in a ghost cold expression of fear, like he had seen some heinous crime being committed right in front of him. Suddenly the lights of the store flickered on, and John fell to the floor. Catching him in midair, I attempted to shake him awake, but he was out cold, literally. His skin was ice cold, almost like he was dead, but his chest still moved up and down. I laid him on the ground and pulled out the hunting knife I had brought. I had originally brought it for carving something into the wall to leave one final mark on this place, but unfortunately it was now a self-defense weapon. Walking over to the breaker, I noticed that the master switch was off. I didn't know if there was a second breaker, or if the store was somehow getting power from some secondary backup generator, but regardless, I flipped it back on. This promptly turned the lights on, and I kept it that way so as to avoid the police showing up to a fully lit abandoned store with 2 random strangers in it. I went and picked up John's things, and then picked up John. I was about to walk out of the store when I heard a click from the back. Dropping John, I pulled my knife and yelled into the pitch black. "Who's there?" I yelled, receiving no response. At this point, I was genuinely creeped out. I stowed my knife and picked up John and went to push open the door. The door was locked from the outside. "Oh, fuck you," I complained to no one. Looking around, I spotted an emergency crowbar in a glass case labeled "Emergencies Only" in bright red text. Breaking the glass, I picked it up and attempted to break one of the windows. I swung as hard as I could, but the glass would not break. We were stuck inside. I thought about calling the police, but I didn't want to have to explain to them why we were there, so I decided against it. I placed the crowbar on the ground along with John and sat down next to the door. After about 5 minutes, John woke up in a panic. "We need to get out of here now," he screamed, pushing at the door. When he eventually looked down and saw me not helping him, I assumed he had realized the door wasn't going to open. "What's the rush, Mr. Brave and Bold?" I scoffed. "Too scared of a little dark?" "You don't understand," he said. "If we don't get out, he's going to..." Suddenly a loud crash came from the back of the store. I grabbed the crowbar and handed it to John. "Free man it up, smartass. You have the point." He gulped, and we both walked towards the sound. As we walked by, I noticed some of the items in the store had been moved. Cups were in the toys aisle. Notebooks were in refrigerators. It was a very strange detail, considering I didn't remember when they had moved. Suddenly, John screamed and dropped the crowbar, darting for the door. I turned towards him and then towards where he had been looking, and I realized why he had run. Standing there was a tall figure with pure white eyes and a smile wider than my own hand. It stared down at me for a second or two, before reaching down and picking me up with a long black tentacle. I took out my knife and stabbed the tentacle. Setting me free, and I ran. I ran after John, trying to keep up. Luckily, the force of John slamming into the glass window seemed to finally bust it, and he rolled out into the parking lot. I followed suit, and as we both got into my car, the figure began hovering towards us, a loud, ear-piercing screech along with it. The second my car started, I floored the gas and swerved out of the parking lot into the street. We didn't care if the cops caught us anymore. We just needed to run. We drove at top speed for about 20 minutes before pulling up to a curb. I slumped back into my seat, and John did the same. "What the fuck was that, John?" I screamed. "You could have had us killed." He turned to look at me, and then started to cry. "Fuck, man," he said, slumping further into his chair. I sat up straight and sighed, staring at the road. Then a tap on my window. "Come on back, boys. We haven't had a proper conversation." I turned slowly to look. It had the voice of Mr. Eisen, but the figure was anything but. I finally got a glimpse of it in the short second my nerves were gnawed out of the adrenaline. It was a tall figure, no doubt. It stood on 2 slender legs stretching higher than my car. Its torso and head were made entirely from what looked like rotten meat, and its face was the same. Its eyes pierced into my soul, and its smile shook me to my very core. I slammed on the gas, flying away at breakneck speeds. The figure did not move, only stared off at us as we flew into the darkness. I made several sharp turns and eventually got onto a highway. It was then that I realized John had passed out, and I started towards the nearest emergency room. It's been about 2 or 3 weeks since that night. The police never caught us, thank God, and John ended up having a severe memory loss of the whole event. He's back to his old self now, but something about that neighborhood makes me not want to go back to it at night.